So let's review the case Endius Inc., which is a case on strategic decision making applied to medical devices. The objective here will be to give you the essence of what happened in the case, as well as to teach strategic decision making, and not only that, give you an overview of the medical device industry. So let's look at the specific learning objectives associated with this particular module. 1, to trace the development of the medical device product from R&D through commercialization. Number 2, to illustrate strategic decision making regarding the development of a product and the decision. Do you develop it in-house or do you contract it out? And that was the decision that was facing the protagonist, if you will, in the Endius Inc. case. 3rd, to outline the key legal and regulatory aspects of medical device development. And lastly, to identify sources of financing for entrepreneurs. So let's begin with defining exactly what is a medical device. If you will note for this particular image here, you see a host of things, from those things which are implantable, that intraocular lens, to a Band-Aid. And you wouldn't necessarily think that a Band-Aid would be a medical device, but it is. So it's a whole range of things, as well as a thermometer is a medical device. One of the controversies that's happening right now within healthcare is whether an app is actually a medical device or not. And it all depends upon the app. In fact, there's about 170 pages worth of guidelines produced by the FDA which discuss about apps and whether they're medical devices and what type of medical devices. So these are some important points for you to focus upon when thinking about medical devices. A device definition excludes products that achieve their primary intended purpose through chemical action. So it tends to be something that's physical or even now digitized, not something that's chemical. Another exclusion factor are dependent upon being metabolized, so think medication, for the primary achievement of their primary intended purposes. So if you were to put an intraocular lens, that's not metabolized. But if you were to actually put in eye drops, that is metabolized. So these are the excluding factors for medical devices. Now let's focus on product development and commercialization. But before we move into that turf, let's take a look at strategic framework. Because before you actually go into R&D and commercialization, you have to think about, where am I headed? Yep. So where are we going as a product? Where are we going with regard to a population? Where am I going with regard to a company? So let's go back to the case. What are the strategic decisions facing Tom Davidson, the CEO of Endius Inc.? And what I'd like you to do is to reflect upon the case and just kind of jot it down. What were the strategic decisions that he was facing? Clearly, it was produce in-house or contract out, but were there other strategic decisions as well? So let's go through this true-false for strategic decisions. 1, the product development process. Strategic decision, true or false? That is true, because if you think about medical devices in the pharmaceutical industry, is you really need that product pipeline. And that product pipeline enables you to have brand awareness. It also drives revenue. Let's look at number 2, product commercialization. Strategic decision, true or false? Hopefully you said true, because fundamentally you can't generate revenue until you commercialize. So that's extremely important. In-house development versus contract development. Strategic decision, true or false? Hopefully you had true. And if you look at this particular case for Endius Inc., you know the rationale for that. Cash burn. So what do I mean by cash burn? Is, let's say you get $50 million from VC at a Series 3 round of funding, and you may have 24 months in which you have to allocate that $50 million. So your burn rate is how much money are you going through on a monthly basis. And you don't want to run out of money until you achieved your contracted milestones. So cash burn, strategic decision, yes or no? Actually, that's false. So securing financing is a strategic decision, but really monitoring that cash burn is more tactical. Financing, strategic decision, true or false? I just gave away the answer. So the obvious answer for that is true. So I really want you to be able to distinguish between strategic decisions, operational decisions, and tactical decisions. So let's go back to what was facing Tom Davidson, the CEO of Endius Inc. Is, do I develop this in-house or do we outsource it, or some hybrid of the two? That was the strategic decision. So if you will note here, he had a number of different sourcing options. So if you go to the bottom here, you will see at the very bottom, you'll see kind of the pure buy at one extreme. And at the top, you'll see the pure make at another extreme. So there's a range of different choices that he could make. These are strategic choices. What you can also do is use what's called a build versus buy decision matrix. And that's something that you were required to do when you worked on the case, is a build versus buy decision matrix. That can help with the strategic decision-making process. So if you note on this particular one, when you begin to do that, you have in-house buy, you also have buy option, and you have buy option number 2. So those are some of the things that you can really think about when you're building out that particular template. So again, you begin here, then you go here, and then you go here, and you fill everything out in that particular template. This template will not make the decision for you, but it will give you some data in an organized fashion to facilitate that strategic decision. So medical devices are filled with a whole bunch of legal and regulatory affair issues. In fact, at Purdue University, you can get a Master's of Science just in medical device regulatory affairs. So professionals that know the law, know regulations, know pharmaceuticals, as well as medical devices, they're highly sought after because you have to do a number of things with the FDA and with clinical trials management. So let's look at the different classes of medical devices. The first one is class 1. So a tongue suppressor is one. So general controls are sufficient to provide reasonable assurance of the safety and effectiveness. So what's of paramount importance first, even before you talk about efficacy or effectiveness, is safety. It must be safe. And those are just some examples of class 1 devices. Class 2 devices, and you can see the instrumentation here from a pump. General controls alone are insufficient to assure safety and effectiveness, and existing methods are available to provide such assurances, also subject to special controls. So a little bit more rigor than class 1, but not as rigorous as class 3. So class 3 are those things that are typically implanted within the human body, as well as those things that are instrumental for life. Let's look at the definition. Insufficient information exists to determine that general and special controls are sufficient to provide reasonable assurance of the safety and effectiveness of such devices. And then such devices are 1. Life-sustaining or life-supporting. Substantial importance in preventing impairment in human health, and the key word here is or, not and, preventing unreasonable risk of illness or injury. So first you have to make the determination, is this a medical device, yes or no? And then once that decision is made, is it class 1, class 2, or class 3? So that's the whole R&D process. Now fundamentally, when you look at it from a strategic point of view, you got to get this device to market. Because if you don't get the device to market, it's not going to be used, so the efficacy of it will not occur, and it cannot be commercialized from a revenue generation perspective. So the FDA has a number of different mechanisms and hoops, if you will, that you have to go through before you actually go to market. So one is called Premarket notification, or the 510K. And these are 3 critical factors when you're looking at pre-market notification. 1, use for devices that are substantially equivalent to a predicate device. Sounds like a bunch of attorneys wrote that language, and they did. So what is a predicate device? A predicate device, let's say you have a thermometer. So a thermometer has been around for years and years and years. So how does your new thermometer, have substantial equivalence to existing or predicate devices on the market? Second point, the manufacturer must notify the FDA 90 days for proposing to the market this particular device. So you really have to have excellent project management and keep track of timelines and deadlines. Number 3, the burden, say it again, the burden is on the manufacturer to demonstrate that the device is what? To demonstrate that the device is substantially equivalent. Substantially equivalent. And always the device is as safe and as effective as an existing marketing device. So that's the essence, if you will, of pre-market notification, or the 510K. Then you have another hoop that you have to go through. And I love this picture because you see this like with stacks and stacks of information. So this is the pre-market approval application, or what I'd like to say is the Job for Life Act for attorneys and regulators. So this one is only, if you will note, is only for Class 3 devices and for new types of devices, and it may require preclinical as well as clinical data from an investigational device exemption. So there's a lot of paperwork and regulations that need to be completed. Another classification is the humanitarian device exemption. So these are used for devices that will benefit patients with rare conditions. It's similar to the Orphan Drug Act. So how is that defined rare? 4,000 fewer people actually experience this disease or illness. So if you think about it from the medical device perspective, they like the blockbuster strategy. So the blockbuster strategy is you have a device that can reach tens of millions of people. So it's really volume-based pricing with tens of millions of people. You penetrate that, and that's huge dollars. But if you have a rare disease or illness where there's only, let's say, 2,200 people in the world that have that particular condition, then you can't do a low price play because it's not going to work. The numbers don't add up. And you can't really do an exorbitantly high price as well because it may be so expensive that individuals can't afford it, governments can't afford it, and or insurance companies won't cover all of it. So these applications for HDEs must demonstrate, and it's interesting, the term that is used here is they must demonstrate probable benefit, probable. And the devices must be used under IRB approval, and IRB approval is Institutional Review Board. So hospitals, health systems, pharmaceuticals, medical device equipments, universities, the government, they have IRBs. And IRBs are put in place to make sure that any research that's conducted is conducted in an ethical fashion and that keeps the patient's interests primary and supreme. And the device must be available at a cost, but a cost which is affordable, but that's a controversial issue. So let's go back. So we have reviewed what a medical device is. We also looked at the classes of medical devices. Then we began to take a look at the legal regulatory aspects, and now I want to focus on the sources of financing for medical device entrepreneurs. So I'm going to walk you through this financing continuum. So it's a little bit busy, but let's kind of take our time as we walk through this. So let's begin with owner's money. So you have to invest. And in fact, a lot of venture capitalists, if you go up here, they won't invest unless you've invested as the owner. And then if we go to the very top here, we have an IPO. And an IPO is an initial public offering. So when someone says that they're going to go public, which means that a particular company is going to be listed on an exchange, like the New York Stock Exchange, then they have to go through an IPO. They work with attorneys, they work with investment bankers, and then they file the IPO. The IPO is approved by the Securities and Exchange Commission, and then now their particular stock is traded on a market. So let's go back to the owner's money and walk up this particular financing stairwell, which I like to call it. So owner's money, typically $10,000 to $100,000. Family, friends, and fools. Yep, 20 to 250. Angel investors. So angel investors are typically very wealthy people that are passionate about a particular cause. And then what they will do is they will give money, most cases in exchange for equity, ownership in the company. Some cases not in exchange for equity. So it really depends upon the angel. You also have angel networks. So that figure is listed there. Then you have seed capital. So seed capital is you have an idea, you want to bring this idea. First, is it technologically possible? Is it scientifically feasible? A. And then B, does it have a market potential? Then C, is it commercializable? Then D, is it scalable? So the seed capital really begins with bringing this idea into fruition. The VCs, or the venture capitalists, what they're looking for is a return on their investment. And that return has to be greater than what they would get if they were to allocate that money in a similar or other investment. Then you have banks and government programs. So with regard to health and medical devices, I want to talk about one particular program. So if you have something to write on or type on, write these 4 letters, SBIR. So again, SBIR. So that's Small Business Innovation Research. And I would encourage you to kind of Google that and take a look at that. That, in essence, is kind of government venture capital for scientific startups. And you have private placements. So private placements is an offering is made to maybe a private equity group. An offering is made to a small number of investors. So it's not on a public market, and they can invest. And then finally, you have the IPOs. So this is really the source of financing. So very few companies actually get to an IPO, and also very few companies actually get to VCs, but you can still be successful. So this goes through the main differences between angels and the VCs. So I would encourage you to take a look at what those differences happen to be. In general, you begin with the angel, and then you make a decision as to whether you'll go with the VC. So these are some factors with regard to successful funding of ventures. So one is the characteristic of the entrepreneur. The other is the characteristic of the enterprise. So that's the business that's surrounding this medical device. The other is sources of advice around financing, around operation, around governance. And the other is the characteristics of the request. So those are 4 critical factors that will determine to some degree your success in seeking funding. So let's look at some of the returns on investments that are expected. So if you will note is just for the startup idea, let's begin with that. So 60+%. So what the VCs are looking for is 10 to 15 times their initial investment. That's a huge play. Then if you note, then you go to financing a new business. So if you look here, you'll find that it's actually decreasing in number until you get there. Because what it means is at the idea stage, it's a lot more risky than at new business development and expansion. So in exchange for that risk, they want a higher reward, hence the 10 to 15 times the investment. So what happened to Endius Inc.? Endius Inc. was a real company. And if you'll note on this headline here, Zimmer acquiring MIS spinal implant company, Endius. So there was an acquisition. And if you go to the bottom here, it says Endius investors who contributed about $70 million to the company since 1997 include the Carlyle Group, Cardinal Partners, Morgan Stanley, and EGS Healthcare Partners. So that's how it wound out is they didn't go public, but they got sold to Zimmer. So that was probably a good thing for everybody involved, including Tom Davidson, the CEO. So what are the key takeaways? So on the discussion board, what I'd like you to do is to identify 2 key takeaways from you with regard to the Endius case study. And respond to this question. After reading this case, I am more or less interested in becoming an entrepreneur within the next 5 years. And as always, please remember to refer to the syllabus for upcoming deadlines. So that's the Endius Inc. story, and the goal here was not just to look at Endius Inc. from an entrepreneurial perspective, but to teach you a little bit about the medical device industry and a little bit about the differences between angel money and VC money. Thank you very much.